the mansion that killed everyone who slept there. A Sherlock Holmes story, Chapter 1, The Letter That Smelled of Death. It was on a Tuesday morning in the last week of October, when the great city of London lay wrapped in one of its most suffocating fogs, that a visitor arrived at our Baker Street. Rooms who would set into motion one of the most extraordinary affairs I have ever had the privilege to record. Holmes had been in one of his dark, contemplative moods for 3 days, unwashed, unspeaking, playing discordant fragments upon his violin at 2 in the morning, and leaving pipes, half-smoked across every horizontal surface. I had learned, in our years together, that these black periods were not depression in the common sense, rather the combustion of a great intellect denied its proper fuel. I was seated by the fire with the morning edition of the Daily Telegraph, when Mrs. Hudson knocked, and her expression told me the matter was unusual, even before she spoke. "A Mrs. Eudora Blackwood," she said, with a slight lowering of her voice that suggested the woman was in some distress. "She has no appointment, Mr. Watson, but she says it is a matter of life and death. Her own life, she seems to think." Holmes uncurled from his armchair with the sudden elasticity that always surprised me, though his languid postures were merely theatrical patience. "Send her up, Mrs. Hudson. Life and death," he repeated, his grey eyes kindling, "is the only currency that interests me this morning." Eudora Blackwood was a woman of perhaps 45 years, handsome, in the way that grief has not yet quite consumed, with dark eyes set in a pale face and dressed in mourning black, so thorough that even her gloves were ebony. She carried herself with a rigid composure that spoke of considerable effort, and as she settled into the chair Holmes indicated, I noticed that her hands were not entirely. Still, there was a faint tremor about the fingers that no woman of her discipline would have permitted had she been fully in command of herself. "Mr. Holmes," she began, her voice low and steady, "I am told you do not deal in superstition." Holmes said nothing, but inclined his head fractionally. "Good, because what I am about to tell you will sound, to any reasonable person, like the most absurd superstition imaginable. And yet 4 people are dead, and I believe I am to be the 5th. She produced from her reticule a letter. Cream paper, folded 3 times, sealed originally with black wax, and placed it on the table before Holmes. He did not touch it immediately. Instead, he studied her. "You have travelled this morning from somewhere in Hampshire," he said quietly. "Not by the earliest train you hesitated before coming. The letter has been in your possession for 8 days. Though you received a second communication 4 days ago that finally forced your hand, your husband has been dead less than 6 months. You have not slept properly in a fortnight." Mrs. Blackwood stared at him. "How can you possibly? The chalk soil of Hampshire still marks the sole of your left boot, despite brushing. The morning trains would have brought you here before 9. It is now past 11, which means you took the 10:15 after considerable internal debate. Your right glove has been twisted and untwisted so many times the seam at the index finger has begun to split. The mourning band on your left wrist is of the freshest black, not the faded sort one sees after a year of loss. It's for sleep. The shadows beneath your eyes are not the simple purple of fatigue, but the yellowish grey that accumulates over many nights, and the small muscle below your left eye has the faint involuntary twitch of the chronically exhausted." He paused. "The second letter I infer, because the first, which I have not yet touched, acquired the particular crease pattern of a document repeatedly handled and refolded, while your distress has a quality of recent escalation rather than long festering dread." She exhaled slowly. "You are everything they said you were. There was no flattery in it. Simply a woman measuring a tool she hoped might save her life. My husband, Sir Gideon Blackwood, died in his sleep on the 17th of April, in the east wing of Blackwood Manor, our estate in the New Forest. He was the fourth person to die in that manner, in that house, within 2 years. The first was a house guest, Lord Pemberton, in the autumn before last. Then my husband's cousin, Mr. Felix Blackwood, in the January just past. Then our gamekeeper, a man named Horace Wren, in March. Finally, Sir Gideon himself. She folded her hands. Each of them was found dead in the morning, in their bed. No sign of violence and no evident cause. The local doctor attributed each death to heart failure. Scotland Yard sent a man who found nothing. The second doctor from London agreed with the first. Holmes had at last taken up the letter, holding it by its extreme corners, and was examining it under the light. "And you have now received a letter," he said, "informing you that you are next. 2 letters. The first arrived 8 days ago. Anonymous, hand-delivered to the Manor Gate after dark. It said simply, 'The house knows who is left. Sleep at your peril.'" She paused. I thought it a cruel jest from some village lunatic. Then 4 nights ago I received the second, slipped beneath my bedroom door while I was in the adjoining dressing room. Which means someone entered the manor, moved through it silently, left again without being seen. This one said, "The 5th night is chosen. Prepare accordingly." A silence fell upon the room, broken only by the low hiss of the gas and the muffled passage of a cart below in Baker Street. Set down the letter and turned to me with an expression I had learned to associate with something rare, genuine, unfeigned interest. "Watson," he said, "I believe we shall need to visit Hampshire." Chapter 2. The Physician's Peculiarity. Holmes spent the remainder of that morning in a state, concentrated energy that was, in its way, as dramatic as his previous inertia. He sent 3 telegrams before noon, 1 to Inspector Lestrade at Scotland Yard, 1 to a correspondent in the New Forest, whose name he did not share with me, and 1 whose contents and recipient he sealed before I could observe either. He then proceeded to spread across our dining table every newspaper he could locate that had covered any of the 4 deaths at Blackwood Manor, supplemented by 3 back issues of the Hampshire Chronicle that he extracted, with unerring certainty, from the 3rd shelf of his 2nd filing cabinet. "You keep files on Hampshire estates?" I asked, watching him work. "Keep files on everything that may one day prove useful," he replied without looking up. "Blackwood family has occupied that estate for 200 years. The house itself is architecturally unusual, built in 1673 over the foundations of a considerably older structure, extensively modified in 1801, and modified again in 1887 when the east wing was added. The east wing," he added with a slight emphasis, "where all 4 deaths occurred. I had not known that. All 4? The newspaper reports I read mentioned only Sir Gideon's room. The newspapers were poorly informed. Lord Pemberton occupied the East Wing's green guest suite. Felix Blackwood was using the room adjacent to it, the one called the Tapestry Room in older records. Horace Wren, the gamekeeper, is more interesting. He had no business being in the East Wing at all. Quarters were above the stables. Yet he was found dead in a small service room on the East Wing's ground floor, which suggests he was either searching for something or meeting someone. This cast the matter in an entirely different light. "Then you believe the deaths are connected in more than circumstance?" Holmes looked at me over the papers with an expression of mild, affectionate impatience. "I believe, Watson, that 4 people dying in the same wing of the same house over 20 months, apparently of cardiac arrest with no other evident cause, strains the capacity of coincidence to an extent that should embarrass any coroner who endorsed that conclusion. More importantly, come here, look at this." He had laid out 4 documents side by side, the death certificates which Mrs. Blackwood had brought with her in the same reticule as the threatening letters. I studied them with the eye of a physician who had signed many such papers. "Heart failure," I said. "All 4. The attending physician is the same man, Dr. Randolph Craik of Lyndhurst. Indeed, and notice anything remarkable about the manner in which Dr. Craik has completed these documents. I looked more carefully. The description of symptoms preceding death is entirely absent in the first 3 certificates. In the 4th, Sir Gideon's, he has written, "No antecedent symptoms reported," which is a remarkable thing to write on a death certificate. Holmes said, because it raises immediately the question, reported by whom? Who observed Sir Gideon in the hours before his death? His wife, presumably. Mrs. Blackwood, who tells us she and her husband occupied separate bedrooms, she in the main house, he in the east wing, and who states she last saw him alive at dinner. Between dinner and the discovery of his body at 8 the following morning, no one, by her account, visited Sir Gideon's room. Holmes tapped the certificate, so Dr. Craik's notation means that either he invented the phrase to fill a blank, or he had information from some other source about what Sir Gideon experienced, or did not experience in his final hours. You think Dr. Craik knows more than he has stated? I think Dr. Craik is worth a conversation. Holmes folded the certificates and returned them to the envelope. But there is another peculiarity, Watson, and this one comes from you, or rather from your professional knowledge. If a man of Sir Gideon's age, 52, in apparently good health, active, not markedly overweight, dies suddenly of cardiac arrest in his sleep, what would you expect the body to show? I considered this carefully. The face and extremities might show some cyanosis, bluish discoloration, if the heart simply stopped. There might be evidence of a final spasm, a twisted or clenched posture, and if there were none of these, then I would want to know considerably more about the circumstances. Mrs. Blackwood tells me, and this detail appears in none of the newspaper reports, that her husband was found lying on his back with his hands folded, across his chest, his face entirely peaceful, and the bedclothes barely disturbed. Holmes met my eyes, as though he had been carefully arranged after death, or as though death came with such absolute suddenness that no reflex of distress had time to manifest. The implications were unpleasant, and I said so. You're suggesting a substance of some kind, a poison with rapid cardiac action. I am suggesting we keep our minds open and our observations sharp, Holmes replied. We leave for Hampshire at 7 tomorrow morning. I would suggest you bring your medical bag. Chapter 3, Blackwood Manor at Dusk the New Forest in late October, is a place of particular, melancholy beauty. Ancient oaks gone to copper and bronze, the bracken turned to rust, and the light, even at midday, coming in at a low angle that gives shadows an unnatural length. We hired a trap at Lyndhurst Station, and Mrs. Blackwood, who had returned ahead of us, had sent her own coachman to meet us, a grim-faced man named Tetch, who spoke not a word during the 4-mile drive through lanes that grew progressively narrower and more enclosed. I had formed, from the newspaper descriptions and from Mrs. Blackwood's account, an image of Blackwood Manor that the reality exceeded in almost every particular. It was a large Jacobean structure of dark brick, partially covered in ivy that had turned to vivid scarlet in the autumn cold, with 2 wings extending from the central block and a row of chimneys that in silhouette suggested the crenellations of a much older fortress. The east wing, that notorious wing, was architecturally distinct from the rest. Built in a different brick, slightly lower roofed, its windows narrower and less ornate, as though it had been designed by a man with less money or more anxiety than the original architect. Holmes was out of the trap before it had fully stopped, and I observed him do something that struck me as curious. Before approaching the front door, he walked the entire perimeter of the east wing, at a brisk pace, hands clasped behind him, head down. He was back before I had finished paying Tetch. What did you observe? I asked. The drainage, he said. But let us meet the household first. Eudora Blackwood received us in the drawing-room of the main house, a room of considerable elegance, portraits of Blackwood ancestors, regarding in us with the painted sternness of an earlier and more certain age. With her were three others whom she introduced in turn. The first was Mr. Cornelius Blackwood, Sir Gideon's younger brother, lean man of 40, with sharp features, and the carefully maintained calm of someone who has trained himself not to show what he feels. The second was Miss Harriet Quelch, the housekeeper, a woman of perhaps 60, with iron-grey hair and the watchful eyes of someone accustomed to running a large establishment with minimal credit. And the third was a young man introduced as Mr. Philip Soane, described himself as Sir Gideon's secretary, and had apparently remained at the manor at Mrs. Blackwood's request to assist with the estate's affairs, a pale, bookish figure in his mid-20s who seemed simultaneously anxious and eager to be useful. Holmes spoke little during the introductions, but I knew from long experience that his silence was not passivity. He was observing everything. The way Cornelius Blackwood stood slightly apart from the others, the way Miss Quelch's eyes moved to the door whenever there was a sound from the corridor, the way Philip Soane folded and unfolded his hands on his knee. After the initial courtesies, Holmes requested to see the east wing. A brief, uncomfortable silence fell over the room. "Of course," Mrs. Blackwood said, recovering first. "Miss Quelch, perhaps you would." "I'll take them," said Cornelius Blackwood, rising. His tone was level, his face unreadable. "I know the wing as well as anyone. Host." The east wing was accessible from the main house through a pair of heavy oak doors, and the temperature dropped perceptibly as we passed through them. Whether from poorer insulation or some other cause, I could not at first determine. The corridor was panelled in dark oak, lit by a series of bracket lamps that Mrs. Blackwood had evidently instructed to be lit in preparation for our visit, though their illumination seemed to be partially absorbed by the dark wood, rather than reflected by it. The rooms in which the deaths had occurred were shown to us in sequence. The green guest suite where Lord Pemberton had died was a handsome room, fully furnished, showing no sign of anything irregular. The tapestry room where Felix Blackwood had met his end was similarly unremarkable. Large, comfortable, with a remarkable set of 17th century tapestries depicting hunting scenes in faded blues and greens, and the room where Sir Gideon Blackwood had slept for the last time was the largest of the three, baronial sort of chamber with a four-poster bed of dark carved wood, a substantial fireplace, and windows that looked out over the rear garden where the ancient trees of the forest began. While Cornelius Blackwood spoke to me in the corridor about some aspect of the estate's history, Holmes moved through Sir Gideon's room, with the quiet, systematic thoroughness that always distinguished his crime scene work from the well-tensioned but ultimately superficial inspections of Scotland Yard. He examined the fireplace, particularly the flue. He examined each window, testing the latches and looking at the frames closely. He crouched by the bed and studied the floor beneath it. He ran his finger along the top of the wainscoting, and examined what he found there under his lens. He pressed his palm flat against each wall in turn. When he rejoined us, his expression was neutral, which told me more than any evident emotion would have. "Tell me, Mr. Blackwood," he said to Cornelius, "who holds the key to the east wing's exterior door, the one that opens from the garden?" Cornelius blinked. "There are 3 keys. My sister-in-law has one. Miss Quelch has one. And I," he paused, "I have the 3rd. And was it at any time during the past year misplaced, borrowed, or otherwise out of your direct possession?" Another pause, this one longer and more careful. "Not that I am aware of," Cornelius said, but his eyes, for just a fraction of a second, moved to the window, and Holmes, I was quite certain, saw it. Chapter 4. The Doctor of Lyndhurst. We called upon Dr. Randolph Craik the following morning, having spent the night at Blackwood Manor. Holmes in the tapestry room, I in a guest room in the main house. Division, he suggested without explanation, and which I accepted, having learned not to question the reasoning behind his spatial arrangements until it became apparent, as it always eventually did. I slept uneasily, as any man might in a house with such a history, but without incident. Holmes, when I encountered him at breakfast, appeared entirely untroubled, and had evidently been awake since before dawn. Dr. Craik's practice was situated in a comfortable Georgian terrace on Lyndhurst's main street. The man himself was a surprise. I had poured from the imprecision of his death certificates, an image of a rural physician of the incurious, comfortably incompetent type. A man who would accept the convenient diagnosis over the correct one, because the convenient one caused less paperwork. Dr. Craik was nothing of the kind. He was perhaps 55, lean and precise in his movements, with the clear, analytical eyes of a man who had once been, and perhaps still was, a first-rate medical mind. His reception of us was polite, but carefully measured. He knew who Holmes was. The newspapers had seen to that. And he had clearly spent some time before our arrival deciding exactly how much to reveal. "I expected someone would come eventually," he said, after we had settled in his consulting room. "Pattern is too pronounced for a thoughtful man to ignore indefinitely." "Then you agree it is a pattern," Holmes said. "I am a doctor, Mr. Holmes. I certify the cause of death based on the evidence available to me at examination. In each of the 4 cases at Blackwood Manor, the evidence available to me was consistent with cardiac arrest. That is what I certified." He folded his hands. "Whether the cardiac arrest was, in each case, a natural event, that is a different question, and one that lies somewhat outside my official capacity, but not outside your private conclusions." Dr. Craik was silent for a moment. "The first death, Lord Pemberton, did not particularly trouble me. He was a man of 63, with a history of heart irregularity, known to me from previous examinations. A natural death was entirely plausible." He paused. "The second, Mr. Felix Blackwood, was less comfortable. He was 41, no known cardiac history, physically active. Position in which he was found, on his back, quite composed. And the appearance of the face suggested to me a death that had been, for lack of a better word, chemically assisted. But I had no evidence of a specific substance. The laboratory facilities available to me in Lyndhurst are not extensive, and the family—" He stopped. "The family what?" Holmes prompted. "The family were anxious to avoid publicity. They were, I should say, quite explicit about this anxiety, and since I had no positive evidence of anything criminal—" He spread his hands. "I certified cardiac arrest. And the gamekeeper, Horace Wren, Doctor?" Craik's expression changed subtly. "Wren was different. Wren disturbed me considerably. He was found in a service room in the East Wing, a room used mainly for storage, containing some old furniture and a quantity of equipment related to the house's heating system. He had no business being there. His face showed what I can only describe as a look of extreme shock, far more extreme than anything I observed in the other 3 cases, and there was a faint smell about the body." "What kind of smell?" I asked, leaning forward. "Sweet. Almost floral, but with a bitter undertone. I have been attempting to identify it in my mind ever since, and I am not certain, but I believe, it may have been consistent with the degradation products of a certain class of organic compound." He looked at me directly. "You are a physician, Dr. Watson. I wonder if you have encountered anything in your own experience that might." "Prussic acid has a bitter almond smell," I said. "But the description of the deaths doesn't quite fit cyanide poisoning. You would expect more obvious signs of asphyxial distress. Quite. It was not prussic acid. But it was in that family of reaction, a smell produced by something that had undergone a chemical change." He paused. I should perhaps have pushed harder for a formal inquest at that point. I did not. That failure rests with me. Holmes had been listening, with his fingertips pressed together, his eyes fixed on some middle distance. One more question, Dr. Craik. Time of any of the 4 deaths. Did you notice anything unusual about the heating system of the East Wing? The doctor stared at him. It was a long, wondering stare. How did you know about that? I didn't know, I inferred. Please answer the question. When I attended Wren, his body was found in the morning, as were all the others. The room was extraordinarily warm. Not merely heated, warm, in a way that seemed disproportionate to the fire in the grate, which had burned low, and I noticed that the vent, the heating duct in the wall above the storage shelves, was open, wider than it should naturally sit. He hesitated. I noted this in my personal records at the time. I did not include it in my official report. Do you still have those personal records? I do. I would very much appreciate the loan of them, Holmes said. Chapter 5. The Here Who Waited. It is an uncomfortable thing to suspect a man of murder, when that man has done nothing, in your direct observation, to merit suspicion beyond the conjunction of motive and proximity. I confess that by our second day at Blackwood Manor, I had formed what I considered a reasonably damning circumstantial case against Cornelius Blackwood, and I was not alone in this assessment. Holmes, however, remained frustratingly non-committal whenever I pressed him on the subject. Facts, as I had assembled them, were these. Sir Gideon Blackwood had died without a direct heir. He and Eudora had no children. His will, which Philip Soane Aine the secretary was able to show us, left the estate and the bulk of the fortune to Cornelius, the life interest in the main house for Eudora. This gave Cornelius a powerful motive. He held one of only 3 keys to the East Wing's exterior door. He had been present at the manor during the periods in question. He maintained a set of rooms there, though his primary residence was in London. And when Holmes had asked him about the key, his eyes had moved to the window, with a tell that even I, no trained observer, had noticed. There was also the matter of his financial position, which Holmes had investigated through means he did not fully disclose to me, but which had apparently involved a late-night telegram and a response from a contact in the city. Cornelius Blackwood had, in the 18 months preceding his brother's death, incurred substantial losses on the stock exchange. The estate worth, Philip Soane estimated, something in the region of £80,000, would resolve those difficulties comprehensively. I laid all of this before Holmes as we walked in the rear garden on the morning of our second day, the manor's ancient oaks dripping with the previous night's rain. It is a tidy case, Holmes said when I had finished. Too tidy? I asked, having learned that this was sometimes his response to seemingly strong circumstantial evidence. On the contrary, not tidy enough in the ways that matter. Consider, Watson. Cornelius Blackwood has been systematically killing the occupants of the East Wing over 20 months. What is the mechanism? Simple poison, administered at dinner. Feel? The 4 victims ate and drank with the household on their respective final evenings and suffered nothing. Table. Not a weapon of any conventional kind. The rooms were examined and the bodies showed no marks. Not suffocation for the same reason. Something in the rooms themselves must be the agent. He paused. And if something in the rooms themselves is the agent, Cornelius Blackwood, who holds a key to the East Wing's exterior door, is certainly a candidate for its introduction. But so, Watson, anyone else who had access to that wing. Miss Quelch holds a key, I said. She does, and Mrs. Blackwood herself. He stopped walking and looked back at the house. I want to speak to Philip Soane alone before lunch. Will you engage Mrs. Blackwood in conversation for half an hour? Ask her about the estate's history. She will have much to say. I did as Holmes requested, found Eudora Blackwood willing enough to speak of the manor's past. What emerged from that conversation was interesting, if not immediately illuminating. The East Wing had been added in 1887 by Sir Gideon's father, who had inherited a modest fortune from an Indian venture and used it to expand the property. The architect had been a man named Souter, apparently known for unusual heating arrangements. He had designed several country houses with what he called integrated warmth systems, ducted in the walls rather than relying solely on open fires. Blackwood Manor's East Wing had such a system. It was never entirely satisfactory, Mrs. Blackwood said. It required constant attention. Gideon disliked it. He said it made the rooms too warm, and that there was sometimes a smell he couldn't identify. He had been intending to have it removed and replaced with conventional radiators. I thought of Dr. Craig's description of the room where Wren had died. Extraordinarily warm, the duct wide open, sweet and bitter smell, and something shifted in my understanding of the case, though I could not yet see its full shape. Holmes, when I found him after his interview with Philip Soane, was quiet in a way that signalled not absence of thought, but superabundance of it. He said nothing about what Soane had told him, which meant it was either nothing or something crucial. With Holmes, these were usually the same thing viewed from different angles. The heating system, I said. I think it's relevant. I know it is relevant, he replied. I have known since I examined the East Wing rooms yesterday. He looked at me. Knowing a mechanism and knowing a murderer are different matters, Watson. Come. There is a man in the village I need to speak with this afternoon. A man who installed and maintained that heating system for 30 years. Chapter 6. The Furnace Man's Testimony. The man Holmes wished to see was one Albert Foss, retired, formerly employed by Blackwood Manor as its heating engineer and general maintenance supervisor for 3 decades, now living in a small cottage on the edge of Lyndhurst. He was a man of perhaps 70, blunt-handed and deliberate in his movements, the careful precision of someone who has spent a lifetime working with systems that, if carelessly handled, could injure or kill. He received us without great surprise. Word had spread, as it always does in small communities, that London detectives were at the manor, and gave us tea with the impassive hospitality of the Hampshire country. Wife sat in the corner and knitted and pretended not to listen with the transparency of someone who was listening extremely carefully. Began not with the deaths, but with the heating system itself, which was immediately the right approach. Albert Foss brightened perceptibly at the subject. Old Souter's system, he said with irreverence. An engineer reserves for elegant engineering. Nothing like it built today. The principle is simple enough. A central furnace in the cellar below the East Wing, a network of pipes and ducts in the walls distributing hot air through vents in each room, but the execution. That's where old Souter was ahead of his time. The ducts are double-walled. The outer wall carries the hot air. The inner wall is a separate passage, sealed, running through all the rooms and back to the furnace. What was the inner passage used for? Holmes asked. Foss looked at him with the steady measuring gaze of a man deciding whether the question is innocent. Originally, nothing was structural. Souter believed in over-engineering, but in practice, he stopped, and for a moment I thought he would withdraw from the subject. Then he continued. When I was first employed at the manor, there was an old fellow who'd been there since the wing was built. A groundskeeper, parish. He told me that in the old days the inner passage had been used. He said the family had a method of. He used an odd word, sweetening the rooms, putting a particular preparation into the furnace that would be distributed through the inner ducts. What sort of preparation? Holmes's voice was entirely neutral. He didn't know the exact compound. He called it the sleeping mixture, said it had been used in the old days when there were guests the family wanted to to be certain wouldn't cause trouble in the night. He seemed to think it was a historical curiosity, something from the previous century. Foss paused. I thought so too at the time. Sealed the inner passage off. Added a brace across the furnace room access. When I did a full overhaul in 1901, I thought it was a safety risk, having an unsealed secondary system. And could that seal be removed? In theory. If a man knew where it was and had the right tools, he could remove the brace in an hour. Fossers looked at Holmes steadily. You're not asking idle questions, are you, Mr. Holmes? No. I am asking questions whose answers may establish how 4 people died. Holmes leaned forward slightly. Is there anyone currently at the manor? Or recently connected with the manor? Who would have known about the inner passage? Foss thought carefully. I told Sir Gideon about it when I did the overhaul. He didn't seem very interested. He disliked the heating system in general. Miss Quelch, the housekeeper, been at the manor since before I retired. She'd know as much about the building as anyone. He paused again. And there's the plans. The architectural plans for the East Wing. Soter's originals. I know Sir Gideon kept them in the estate office. Anyone who had access to those plans and knew how to read them would know about the passage. Who had access to the estate office? Well, Sir Gideon himself. His secretary, I suppose. And Mr. Cornelius. He was always interested in the estate's business affairs, even when Sir Gideon was alive. On the walk back to the manor, I considered what we had learned. A concealed system of ducts, designed or adapted to distribute a substance through sealed rooms while the occupants slept. Sleeping mixture. With a historical precedent on the property itself. And now a narrowing of the field of suspects. To those who had access to the architectural plans that revealed this system's existence. Holmes, I said, what is the substance? The sleeping mixture. I have a hypothesis, he said. The sweet, bitter smell that Dr. Craik noticed, the floral degradation product, points strongly to a compound in the chloral family, possibly something derived from natural sources with a similar mechanism. A compound that, introduced in sufficient concentration into a sealed room via the heating ducts, would render occupants deeply unconscious and sufficient dose, or with sufficiently vulnerable subjects, would cause cardiac arrest through respiratory depression. He paused. It is, when you consider it, an almost elegant method. No mark on the body, no evidence in the room. The body showing the composed appearance of deep sleep, and the system that delivers it is built into the very walls of the house. Then all the murderer required, I said, was access to the furnace room, knowledge of the inner passage, and the compound itself. Precisely. And knowledge of when each victim would be sleeping in the East Wing. He looked at me. Which brings us back to someone within, or very close to, the household. Chapter 7. Misdirection in the library. It was Philip Soane who, on the morning of our 3rd day at the manor, presented us with what appeared to be the conclusive evidence against Cornelius Blackwood. He came to Holmes with the air of a man who has spent the night in an agony of indecision, and he placed upon the table in the library, where we had established our working base, a small notebook. Its cover of dark green leather, pages densely covered in a neat cramped hand. I found this, he said, in Mr. Cornelius Blackwood's room, I should say. I was not searching his room without reason. He asked me last week to find a document he said he had left in the writing desk there, and when I went to retrieve it, the notebook fell from between 2 books on the shelf above. Holmes examined the notebook without opening it for a full 30 seconds, turning it over in his hands, examining the spine, the cover, the edges of the pages. Then he opened it. The entries were dated and systematic. They recorded, in what was evidently Cornelius Blackwood's hand, a series of calculations and notes that appeared to relate to the estate's finances, projections, losses, valuations, but interspersed among these, in a cipher that was not a particularly sophisticated one, were references that Holmes decoded aloud in a matter of minutes. References to the East Wing's heating system, to the inner duct passage, to a substance described only by a chemical formula, to 4 names: Pemberton, Felix, Wren, Gideon, each followed by a date that corresponded precisely to the date of each victim's death. The room was very quiet when Holmes finished. "This is damning," I said, meaning it. "It is," Holmes agreed. His tone was entirely flat. "Will you take it to Lestrade?" "Not yet." I looked at him. Something in his face, not doubt exactly, particular careful quality of attention, gave me pause. "You don't think it's genuine?" "I think," Holmes said, setting the notebook down with deliberate care, "that this is either the most carelessly incriminating document I have ever encountered, and Cornelius Blackwood, whatever else he may be, is not a careless man, or it has been placed precisely where it would be found by precisely the person who found it." He looked at Soane. "You say the notebook fell from between 2 books on the shelf above the writing desk. Which books?" Soane blinked. "A medical encyclopedia on one side, I think, and a book on natural history. Show me." We went to Cornelius Blackwood's room, a precise, ordered room, its surfaces clear, its shelves meticulously arranged, and Soane indicated the shelf. Holmes examined the 2 books in question. Medical Encyclopedia, a large, authoritative volume, showed, when opened, pages that had never been turned. Spine had the stiffness of an unread book. The natural history volume was similarly pristine. Between the 2 was a gap of perhaps 3 centimetres, the exact width of the green notebook. "The books on either side," Holmes said, "clearly never been read by the room's occupant. They are decorative. A man who wished to conceal a notebook containing evidence of multiple murders would not hide it in a gap that is immediately visible to anyone glancing at the shelf, particularly not between 2 books of such obvious disuse that the gap stands out like a gap in a row of teeth." He turned to Soane. "You were not searching. You came for a specific document. Yet you noticed the notebook immediately." Soane opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "It caught my eye," he said carefully. "The green cover against the dark spines. Indeed, almost as though it was meant to." After Soane left, Holmes sat in silence for several minutes. "Someone placed that notebook there, Watson. Placed it, knowing that Soane would be sent to that room, knowing that he would find it and bring it to us. It is manufactured evidence, constructed to direct our attention firmly and finally at Cornelius Blackwood. Then Cornelius is innocent? I did not say that. I said the evidence against him has been manufactured. Those are not the same thing. A man may be guilty while someone else attempts to ensure his conviction through false means, perhaps because they share guilt and wish to concentrate it elsewhere. Or a man may be entirely innocent and be framed by a person who knows enough about the case to construct a convincing frame." He stood abruptly. "I need to examine the furnace room. Tonight, after the household has retired, come? Will you come?" "Of course," I said, and found, I said it, that my hand moved involuntarily to check that my service revolver was where I had put it that morning. In my jacket's inner pocket, loaded and ready. Chapter 8, Below the East Wing. It was past midnight when we descended. Holmes had spent the evening hours in what appeared to be a state of social idleness, making conversation with the assembled household after dinner, expressing mild interest in the estate's history, asking Mrs. Blackwood about the portraits in the drawing-room with what seemed genuine aesthetic curiosity. I knew him well enough to understand that he was observing, cataloguing, comparing. The specific object of his observation I could not determine. At 11:30 the household retired. We waited in the library, Holmes reading by lamplight with a concentration that I suspected was partly performance and partly genuine. He was, I believe, rereading Dr. Craik's personal notes, which the doctor had sent by messenger that afternoon. At 10 past midnight, Holmes set the notes aside, rose without speaking, took up the dark lantern he had prepared earlier. I followed. The East Wing at midnight was a different place from the East Wing in daylight. The heating system was not running. The household had apparently found no reason to maintain the East Wing at temperature since Sir Gideon's death. The cold had settled into the panelling and the stone floors with a thoroughness that the inadequate lamps seemed unable to address. Footsteps sounded differently here. There was a faint resonance beneath them that I had not noticed during the day. The ducts in the walls, Holmes murmured, when I commented on this. They amplify footfall. It would be possible to hear movement in the corridor from within a closed room if the duct connecting them were open. The access to the East Wing cellar was through a door near the end of the main corridor, behind a tapestry. Not concealed exactly, but not obvious. Holmes had located it during his first inspection. The cellar stairs were stone, damp, and the air below was cold and smelled of old iron and the particular mineral scent of long undisturbed masonry. The furnace itself was a substantial structure, a cast iron cylinder perhaps 5 feet in height, connected to a network of pipes that spread across the low ceiling of the cellar like the branches of some mechanical tree. Holmes examined the furnace's access panel first, spending several minutes on hands and knees studying the floor around its base. Then he turned his attention to the wall behind it, where a section of the original brickwork had at some point been covered by a wooden partition, presumably the brace that Albert Foss had described adding during his 1901 overhaul. Holmes ran his hands across the wooden partition with extraordinary care. Then he looked at me and pointed. I moved closer and saw what he had seen. The brace was secured at its corners by 4 iron bolts. 3 of these bolts had the thick, uneven patina of metalwork that has not been disturbed in decades. Layered rust and age, the heads slightly misshapen by time. The 4th bolt was different. Its head was clean. The threads where it entered the wall showed bright metal, recently turned. Holmes produced a tool from his inner pocket, and, with considerable care, turned this 4th bolt. It came free without resistance. The partition, released at this corner, swung outward on what proved to be a concealed hinge at the opposite end. The other 3 bolts were purely decorative, screwed into nothing, designed to make the partition look fixed when it was not. Behind it was a narrow chamber, barely wide enough for a man to stand in, rising into darkness above us toward the ceiling, and on the floor of this chamber, carefully arranged, 4 objects. A small bellows of the type used by blacksmiths, a sealed glass vessel containing a pale crystalline substance, a sheet of paper with handwritten instructions, and a pair of heavy rubber gloves. Holmes took up the glass vessel and held it to the lantern. Crystal inside had the faint, sweet smell that I noticed even through the sealed glass, or imagined I noticed, my mind primed by Dr. Craik's description. The instructions in a handwriting I did not recognize described in clinical terms the process of introducing a measured quantity of the crystal into the furnace's secondary air intake. The inner duct passages feed, using the bellows, at what temperature, and for what duration, to achieve the required concentration in each connected room. Chloral hydrate derivative, Holmes said quietly, his voice barely above a breath, mixed with something else, something that enhances the cardiac effect. I shall need a chemist to be certain. The smell and the crystal form are consistent. He was not touching anything beyond what was necessary, and he had noted exactly the position of each object before disturbing it. This has been used recently, Watson. The floor of this chamber has fresh disturbance. Someone has stood here, knelt here, moved these objects and replaced them. He raised the lantern. The inner passage entrance is there. That grating, recently oiled. The rust around its frame has been disturbed. replaced everything as precisely as Holmes could reconstruct its original arrangement, re-secured the partition, and withdrew. In the cellar stairs, Holmes stopped and gripped my arm. "Listen," I listened. From somewhere above us, through the stone, through the ducts, carried by whatever acoustic property the system possessed, I heard, very faintly, the sound of a door closing in the corridor above. "Someone," Holmes said, his voice barely audible, "knows we came down here." Chapter 9, The Second Victim Speaks. What followed in the next 12 hours was a sequence of events that accelerated the case from a state of careful, methodical investigation to something approaching crisis. It began at 7:30 the following morning, when Miss Harriet Quelch did not appear to oversee breakfast, an omission that, given 30 years of punctilious habit, caused immediate unease among the household staff. It became serious when the young kitchen maid sent to knock on Miss Quelch's door received no answer, and, on finding the door unlocked, discovered the housekeeper collapsed across her bed, alive but unresponsive. I reached her within minutes of being summoned and found a pulse. Strong enough, but slower than I would have liked, and respiration that was shallow and laboured. Her face was the flushed, deeply somnolent face of a woman in a drugged sleep, not the grey passivity of coma from injury or stroke. Room smelled of nothing I could identify. But my knowledge of what had been found in the cellar the night before, and the fact that Miss Quelch's room was in the east wing, the only servant who slept in the east wing, focused my diagnostic attention immediately. "She's been drugged," I told Holmes, who was at my shoulder. "The same mechanism, believe, but either the dose was miscalculated, or she is more resistant than the previous victims. She is alive. She must remain so," Holmes said, with a sharpness that was not lack of compassion but urgency. "Can she be safely moved to the main house?" We moved her, with the help of Tetch, the coachman and one of the footmen, to a room in the main house wing, and I sat with her whilst Holmes sent for Dr. Craik from Lyndhurst. The doctor arrived within 40 minutes. He had clearly been expecting, or fearing, exactly this kind of summons, and his examination confirmed mine. He administered stimulants and expressed cautious optimism that Miss Quelch would cover, given that her exposure had apparently been of shorter duration than the fatal doses received by the 4 dead victims. Duck to her room must have been opened later in the night, Holmes reasoned, in a low voice, as we stood in the corridor outside. Or she woke earlier than expected and opened a window. I noticed her window was ajar when we entered. He turned to Dr. Craik. "When she wakes, and I believe she will wake within the hour, I need 5 minutes with her, before anyone else speaks to her." He had them present. Miss Quelch's recovery was rapid once the drugs hold began to relax, and she was conscious, pale, and sharp-eyed when Holmes took his place beside her bed. She looked at him with the directness of someone who has survived something and is freshly acquainted with the value of directness. "Someone put something through the heating duct," she said, before Holmes had spoken. "I could smell it. I've smelled it before, when Sir Gideon was alive, and he had a bad night, and I went to check on him. He said it was nothing, problem with the furnace, but I knew it wasn't." She paused. "I've known for some time that there was something wrong with how those people died. And yet you said nothing," Holmes said, without accusation. "I had no proof, and I was." She stopped, frightened. "Of whom?" She looked at him steadily. "I am not certain. That is the truth. I suspected Mr. Cornelius. He has always wanted this estate, always resented that his brother had it. But there were things that didn't fit." "What things?" The night Horace Wren died. Her voice was careful now, measuring each word. "I heard something. Late, past 2 in the morning. I was awake. I sleep badly in the east wing. Always have. I heard the cellar door open and close, and then footsteps in the corridor. Quiet footsteps, deliberate. Not a large man's step. Not Mr. Cornelius. How do you know it was not Mr. Cornelius? Because Mr. Cornelius walks with a slight irregularity. His left knee was injured years ago, riding, and he favours the right foot. What I heard was an even step, unhurried, she paused, and light, the step of someone quite slight. Holmes said nothing for a moment. Then, Miss Quelch, do you know who has access to the estate's architectural plans? The original drawings for the east wing? They're in the estate office cabinet. Sir Gideon had the key, after his death. She closed her eyes briefly, then opened them. I assumed Mr. Phillips Owain had taken charge of the office. He was dealing with all the estate papers. Holmes rose. He thanked her, told her to rest. In the corridor, stopped walking so abruptly that I nearly collided with him. Watson, he said. The notebook. The forged notebook. Cornelius Blackwood's. Phillips Owain found it. Phillips Owain told us it fell from the shelf. Phillips Owain has access to all the estate's documents, including the architectural plans. Phillips Owain is slight of build and walks with an entirely even step. He turned to me, and his eyes had that particular quality. Not excitement exactly, more a cold, crystalline certainty that I had seen before. At the moments when a case resolved itself into clarity, Phillips Owain recommended that we inspect the east wing, with Cornelius Blackwood as our guide. Chapter 10. The Net Tightens. In the 2 hours that followed, Holmes moved with a speed and purpose that left no room for conversation. He dispatched 2 telegrams, one to Lestrade, requesting that the inspector come immediately to Lyndhurst and bring with him a constable and the authority to make an arrest. One to a chemical analyst in Southampton, who Holmes apparently knew, requesting an urgent assessment of a sample he would send by the afternoon coach. He then gathered the household in the drawing room under the pretext of providing a general statement of what had been discovered regarding Miss Quelch's condition. Philip Owain was present, seated at the periphery of the group, with his characteristic expression of anxious helpfulness. He was a convincing performer. I give him that full credit. His concern for Miss Quelch appeared entirely genuine. His slight frown, when Holmes mentioned that the housekeeper was recovering well and expected to be fully coherent by afternoon, might have been merely concentration. His hands, folded on his knee, were quite still. Holmes's statement to the household was brief and carefully worded. He said that Miss Quelch had experienced a reaction to the east wing's inadequate heating system, that the system had been releasing fumes that were potentially dangerous, that no one should enter the east wing until the system had been fully examined by a specialist. He did not mention the furnace room, or what had been found there. He did not mention the inner duct passage. He said all of this in the calm, formative tone of a man who has reached the end of his investigation and is tidying loose ends before departure. He was, of course, lying, or rather, he was selecting his truths with surgical precision, and leaving the most important one entirely unstated. After the household dispersed, Holmes instructed Mrs. Blackwood, privately in the library, that she should, at luncheon, mention casually that Soane had agreed to catalogue and secure the estate's document collection, and that the office would be locked this afternoon. He told her to seem preoccupied, as though this were an administrative detail rather than a significant step. She was clearly frightened, but she was also, I was learning, a woman of considerable nerve. She nodded and asked no questions. Then Holmes told me his plan. Soane will go to the estate office, he said, not necessarily because of what Mrs. Blackwood says. He may already have planned to do so, but the mention of its contents being catalogued and secured will accelerate his timeline. There are documents in that office, I have checked, that could connect him to the compound used in the heating system. He imported it, Watson. That is how I know for certain. Among the estate papers that Soane has been managing is a delivery receipt, signed in his name, for a quantity of chemicals from a scientific supply company in London, dated 14 months ago. Found it this morning while Soane was at breakfast. He imported the compound through the estate accounts, through a sub-account he created for maintenance supplies. Cornelius Blackwood's name appears on none of the delivery documentation, though it appears in Soane's forged cipher notebook, as though he were the one ordering chemical materials. It was a clever frame, Watson. Cornelius's financial troubles are real. Soane has been managing the estate's accounts and would have known every detail. The motive was plausible, the access was explainable, and the notebook, placed for discovery at exactly the right moment, would have ensured Cornelius went to trial, while the actual killer walked away with whatever Soane expected to gain. What did he expect to gain? I asked. He is the secretary, he inherits nothing. That, Holmes said, is the remaining question, and I believe we will find the answer in the estate office, along with Mr. Soane, within the next 2 hours. He was correct about the timing. At 2:30, as Holmes' eyes waited in the corridor adjacent to the estate office. Concealed behind the half-open door of a linen storage room, Holmes with his back against the wall, and his eyes on the reflection in a carefully angled mirror he had propped against the shelf. Philip Soane appeared at the end of the corridor. He walked with his characteristic, even, unhurried step. He carried nothing visible. He paused outside the estate office door, looked both ways along the corridor with the minimal, controlled glance of someone who has learned to check without appearing to check, then produced a key and let himself in. Give him 4 minutes. Holmes breathed. We gave him 4 minutes. Chapter 11, The Secretary's Confession. Philip Soane was at the filing cabinet when we entered. Not furtively, but with the deliberate efficiency of a man who knows exactly what he wants and where it is. He had a sheaf of papers in one hand and was reaching for a second bundle with the other. He turned when we came in, and for a moment his face was entirely still. Not the stillness of innocence, but the stillness of a man whose internal machinery has just undergone a sudden comprehensive recalculation. Then he smiled. It was a remarkable performance, pleasant, slightly puzzled, entirely controlled. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I was just—" "Mr. Soane," Holmes said, closing the door behind us and standing before it. "Please set those papers on the desk, all of them, including whatever you have in your inside jacket pocket." The smile did not entirely vanish, but it changed character, became something harder, more watchful. "I don't know what you think You visited the furnace room last night," Holmes said. "You heard us in the cellar and retreated. We heard the door above us close. Before our arrival last night, you opened the duct to Miss Quelch's room, intending her death. The dose, I believe, was calculated to be fatal, but she survived because her window was ajar, and because she is apparently more resistant to the compound than your previous victims." He paused. "I should also tell you that Dr. Craik has been asked to preserve a tissue sample from Miss Quelch's clothing, and that my chemical analyst in Southampton will have confirmed the substance's identity by this evening." Philip Soane set the papers on the desk. He did it quite carefully, smoothing the edges. Then he sat down in the chair behind the desk with the air of a man who has decided that a particular phase of his life is over and is taking a moment to acknowledge the fact. "You placed the notebook to implicate Mr. Cornelius Blackwood," Holmes continued. "You created the delivery documentation for the compound under his apparent authority, but using a sub-account to which you had exclusive access. You knew about the inner duct passage from the architectural plans which you found in this office. You knew that Cornelius Blackwood had financial motives that would make him a credible suspect. And you hoped that by the time anyone looked carefully enough to question the manufactured evidence, Cornelius would already be committed for trial. It's been very thorough," Soane said. His voice was quite even. "I suppose you want to know why. I would find it illuminating." Soane was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, the tone had changed. Not confessional exactly. Something beneath the careful control was visible now, raw-edged and old. "I am the illegitimate son of Sir Gideon Blackwood," he said. "Oh, my mother was a woman named Ellen Soane, who worked in this house for 7 years. Sir Gideon was a man who took certain things for granted, his position, his privilege, his freedom from consequence. When my mother became inconvenient, she was dismissed. She died 12 years ago, having spent her life in poverty that she would never have known if Sir Gideon Blackwood had acknowledged his responsibility." He paused. "I knew who I was. I have known since I was 16, when my mother, dying, told me everything. I spent 7 years engineering my way into this household. The right qualifications, the right references, the right amount of ingratiating usefulness, in order to take what should have been mine. You wanted the estate," I said. "I wanted acknowledgement that I existed." His voice was still level, but the control was costing him something now. "Sir Gideon refused. Found the courage to tell him, 3 months after becoming his secretary. He laughed. He said my mother had been. He used words I will not repeat. He said I had no claim on him, or his name, or his property. He offered me a sum of money to resign my position and disappear." A pause. "I declined, chose a different resolution," Holmes said quietly. "Lord Pemberton first, because he was Sir Gideon's closest confidant, the man to whom he had told everything, including about me. I could not risk Pemberton speaking." He said this without visible remorse, though he were describing a logical sequence, steps in a calculation. Felix Blackwood, because he was second in the line of inheritance, and would have contested any claim I made after Gideon's death. Horace Wren, because he saw me in the cellar one night and was beginning to ask questions. He folded his hands on the desk. Sir Gideon himself, because he deserved it. The room was very still. Then Holmes stepped aside from the door and opened it. Inspector Lestrade, who had arrived at the manor an hour before, and had been waiting in the corridor with a patience that spoke well of his professional discipline, entered with his constable. Chapter 12. Lestrade's education. Lestrade had been briefed, in general terms, during the hour he had spent waiting. Briefed by Holmes, who had provided a summary in the drawing-room that was characteristically precise and characteristically incomplete, giving the inspector enough to make the arrest correctly, while withholding the more interesting, analytical architecture, until Soane was in custody and the pressure of the moment had passed. The arrest itself was accomplished without drama. Philip Soane went with the constable without resistance, and, after the door had closed, a look on his face that I can only describe as relief. The particular relief of a man who has been carrying a very heavy thing for a very long time, and has at last been permitted to set it down regardless of the consequences. Lestrade, in the drawing-room afterward, had many questions. Holmes answered them with the thoroughness that he reserved for the inspector on occasions when Lestrade had conducted himself with credit, which this, to be fair to the man, had been, given that he had travelled from London on a single telegram and waited an hour in a corridor on Holmes' word that it would be worth his time. "The forged notebook is the key to the whole misdirection," Holmes explained, as Mrs. Blackwood, Cornelius Blackwood, and I sat and listened. Soane had enough knowledge of Cornelius's financial situation, character, movements, to construct a plausible frame. The cipher he used in the notebook is one he borrowed from a book of historical cryptography in the estate library. I noticed the book this morning, freshly removed from its place on the shelf. The cipher was familiar enough to be decoded within a reasonable time. It had to be, or the notebook would serve no purpose. But unfamiliar enough to seem like a genuine private code. "But why involve us at all?" I asked. He had simply continued. "He did not invite us. Mrs. Blackwood did. Holmes turned to Eudora with a gentleness I had not often seen in him. Threatening letters were Swain's, designed to frighten you into leaving the manor, or failing that, to create evidence of external threat that would further confuse any investigation. But Mrs. Blackwood, instead of leaving or submitting, came to Baker Street. Swain then recognised that our involvement was, paradoxically, an opportunity. If we were to be drawn into the investigation, he would accelerate his own plan. Direct our attention firmly at Cornelius through the notebook, and sure Miss Quelch, who he feared had information, did not survive to provide it. He almost succeeded on both counts, I said. Quelch nearly died, and the notebook was extremely persuasive. The notebook was too persuasive, Holmes said. That was its undoing. Genuine record of 4 murders, kept by the murderer himself in a retrievable location, stretches credibility in a man of Cornelius Blackwood's obvious precision. A forged record, designed to be found, announces itself by being findable. He paused. I should add that Cornelius himself is entirely innocent of the murders, though not of all irregularity. His financial difficulties led him to conduct some quiet negotiations with a buyer for the East Wing's timber rights, without his brother's knowledge, which explains his discomfort when asked about the key. He feared we were investigating that matter. Cornelius Blackwood, who had been sitting with the controlled composure that characterized him, exhaled slowly. How did you know about the timber negotiations? I didn't, Holmes said. I suspected something minor from your behaviour. The confirmation came from Philip Swain's files in the estate office. He had documented everything, including your timber discussions, presumably as additional leverage if he ever needed it. Lestrade, who had been making notes throughout this explanation with the industrious concentration of a student at a particularly demanding lecture, looked up. The chemical substance, you said, a crystal compound introduced through heating ducts. How does a secretary obtain such a thing? He is an intelligent man, with access to scientific literature and adequate funds. His salary was generous. Compound itself is not difficult to obtain from industrial sources if one represents oneself as having a legitimate purpose. The delivery receipt was made out to Blackwood Estate Maintenance account. He created the account himself. Chemistry of the application was available in 19th century medical literature, which he clearly researched carefully. The genius of the method is not in any one element of it, but in the combination. An existing architectural feature, documented historical precedent that he discovered in the estate records, and a compound whose delivery of death mimics natural causes exactly. The room was quiet for a moment. Through the drawing-room windows, the October light was failing early, forest beyond the garden, already darkening to a blue-grey mass beneath a sky the colour of pewter. "Will he hang?" Mrs. Blackwood asked. Voice was entirely steady. Lestrade looked at his notes. 4 counts of murder. Attempted murder of the housekeeper. Yes, Mrs. Blackwood. Expect he will. Chapter 13 of 16. What the walls concealed. On the morning before our departure, Holmes suggested, we walk the East Wing one final time. The heating system had been shut down entirely at his direction. Lestrade's constable had seen to the furnace, and in the grey morning light, with the knowledge of what had occurred there, laid over the physical reality of panelled corridor and carved bedroom door, the place had the atmosphere of somewhere that had witnessed events it would not easily forget. We stood in Sir Gideon's room, where the four-poster bed had been stripped of its linen, and the fireplace held only cold ash. Holmes moved to the wall beside the heating duct, and pressed his palm flat against the panelling, a gesture I remembered from our first inspection. You were listening for the resonance, I said. Even then, on the first day, double-wall construction of the duct system creates a characteristic hollow sound, he said. panelling in a normal wall sounds quite different. I knew on the first examination that there was a secondary cavity in these walls. That was the drainage observation I mentioned to you. Though drainage was not quite the right word. I meant the ventilation architecture. The external examination showed intake grills at the base of the east wing's exterior wall that were incompatible with a simple single duct system. They imply a return air pathway that must exist somewhere, and that pathway, logically, must be the inner passage. You knew about the mechanism before we spoke to Albert Foss. I strongly suspected it. Foss confirmed it and gave it a history. He moved to the window and looked out over the garden. What I did not know, in those first hours, whether the mechanism was currently in use, or was merely a historical artifact that someone had coincidentally learned about. The discovery in the furnace room answered that question. When did you first suspect Soane specifically? Several things accumulated. His access to the architectural plans, which I found evidence of on the very first evening, when I noticed the plan tube in the estate office had been recently moved and replaced at a slightly different angle from where the dust pattern suggested it normally sat. His even, slight footstep. I heard him in the corridor on our first night, doing a circuit of the east wing at 1 a.m. I said nothing to you at the time, because I had no certainty. His behaviour when I presented the false information about Miss Quelch's recovery timeline. I told the household she would be coherent by afternoon, and I watched his face when I said it. A man who had merely tried to cause an accident would be relieved that she survived. A man who needed her not to survive would need to calculate his remaining options. And the notebook was the turning point. The notebook was the confirmation. A real murderer does not keep a coded journal. A man framing another man does, if he wants the frame to hold in court. The construction of the cipher, not quite difficult enough to seem like a genuine private language, not quite simple enough to seem contrived, showed someone of considerable intelligence operating slightly outside their area of mastery. Soane is intelligent, but he is not a criminal by experience. He is a man of deep grievance who took a great deal of time and care over a plan that was in most ways excellent, but which had the fundamental flaw of depending on the wrong people, not asking the wrong questions. We stood in silence for a moment. Then I said, his motive, the illegitimacy, his mother's circumstances, one can understand, if not excuse, bitterness from which it sprang. One can understand it entirely, Holmes said, and there was no coldness in his voice. Sir Gideon Blackwood appears, from every account, to have been a man of casual cruelty toward those with less power than himself. Philip Soane's mother was wronged, and Philip Soane spent his life in a shadow cast by that wrong. Tragedy is not that he felt injustice. He was entirely correct to feel it. The tragedy is what he chose to do with that feeling. He turned from the window. 4 men are dead who had nothing to do with his mother's suffering. 3 of them at least, and a woman nearly died in her sleep, in a house she had served loyally for 30 years. Lord Pemberton and Felix Blackwood, I said, they were simply in the way. Simply in the way, yes. He picked up his hat from the chair where he had set it and moved toward the door. Come, Watson. The Hampshire air has done what it could for us, and Baker Street is waiting. Chapter 14, Mrs. Blackwood's Morning Eudora. Blackwood found us in the library at 9, an hour before our trap was due to collect us for the Lyndhurst station. She was dressed not in mourning now, but in a deep grey that was a step removed from it. A deliberate step, I thought, the sartorial equivalent of a decision made overnight. She carried herself differently too. Still straight, still composed, but with the rigidity of sustained effort replaced by something more natural, and therefore more at ease. She had slept, I suspected, for the first time in weeks without fear. She thanked Holmes first, with a directness that was characteristically free of the elaborate gratitude. that lesser characters deploy when what they really want to do is escape the room. "You have removed something from this house," she said simply. "I do not only mean Mr. Soane. I mean the thing that Soane was, the thing that came here with a plan and a grievance, and lived in our midst for 2 years, and smiled at our breakfast table, and arranged our papers and killed 4 people while appearing to be of service." "He was of service," Holmes said, "genuinely in many respects. The grievance and the plan were entirely separate from the professional competence. They coexisted in him without apparent strain. That is the most frightening aspect of it," she said, "that he was good at his work." She paused, and I saw her adjust internally to the full implications of what she was saying. "I relied on him. I asked him to help manage the estate after Gideon's death. I trusted his judgments." A pause. "He could have killed me at any point in the past 6 months. I slept in the main house, outside the east wing, which is why I survived when others did not. But he could have found a way." "He didn't want to kill you," Holmes said. "You were not in his plan. His intention, after eliminating those he saw as obstacles to any future legal claim, was to approach you with evidence of his parentage, and seek acknowledgement, and, presumably, a financial settlement. The threatening letters were designed to drive you away from the manor, not toward Baker Street. You were not meant to engage a detective. You were meant to be so frightened that you would retreat to London or to relatives. And he would have the estate effectively to himself, while Cornelius, whom he intended to see tried for the murders, was removed from the picture." She took this in with the careful, analytical attention of a woman, rebuilding her understanding of a situation that had been built on false foundations. "And Cornelius will have his timber negotiations to account for to you," Holmes said, "but nothing more serious." A faint, wry expression crossed her face. The first approach to amusement I had seen from her. "He has wanted those timber rights for 10 years. Gideon always refused him." She paused. "I may let him have them. It seems a reasonable recompense for a week of being suspected of murder." She then made Holmes an offer which I had half expected. She named a substantial figure, and Holmes declined it with the courtesy he reserved for offers of money he did not intend to accept, which was most of them, in my observation, when the client was in genuine distress rather than treating his services as a commodity. He named instead a figure considerably lower, said it would cover our expenses and a modest professional fee, and closed the subject before she could argue. She walked with us to the front door. At the threshold, she stopped, and I noticed her looking back at the east wing, where its narrow windows caught the morning light, at an angle that made them look briefly like the closed eyes of a sleeping figure. "What do I do with it?" she said. "The east wing, the heating system. Have the inner duct passage sealed by a builder you employ yourself," Holmes said. "Not a contractor recommended by anyone else. Personally supervise its sealing. Then, if you wish to remain here, and I think you may find that you do, have the east wing refurnished. Let other rooms be lived in. What has been done in a place need not define it indefinitely." He put on his hat. "The house is not cursed, Mrs. Blackwood. It was used as an instrument by a man with a plan. Remove the instrument and what remains is simply a building. A rather fine one, by objective assessment. The trap came, and we went." Chapter 15, The Fog Returns to Baker Street, London, was its usual self when we returned, indifferent to our absence. The fog returned as though it had been waiting on a doorstep. The cabs jostling on the Strand, the newsboys crying something about Parliament. Baker Street received us with the particular quality of welcome that one's own disordered rooms provide after days spent in other people's well-kept ones. Mrs. Hudson had stocked the fire and left a cold supper, and the accumulated correspondence of 4 days had formed an impressive pile on the mantelpiece that Holmes sorted through with practised economy, discarding 3/4 directly into the wastepaper basket, and retaining the rest for later attention. I settled into my armchair by the fire, and found myself turning the case over, as I always did in its immediate aftermath, looking for the things I had not seen at the time, and which only hindsight made visible. The pattern of the case had been one I recognised from others of Holmes's investigations, not the pattern of the crime itself, which was in several respects unique, but the pattern of the investigation, which tended in the most interesting cases to describe a curve. An initial period of apparent clarity in which the obvious suspect loomed large, followed by a complication that undermined the obvious, followed by a period of apparently increased confusion that was, in fact, for Holmes, if not for me, a period of increasing order, followed finally by the resolution that, in retrospect, had the quality of inevitability. What interested me particularly, sitting there with a pipe and the fire's warmth and the city's noise, was the question of Philip Soane. Not the question of his guilt, which was not in doubt, but the question of what kind of story his was, whether it was, at its deepest level, a story about crime, or about inheritance, or about the long and corrosive effects of injustice imperfectly metabolized. Sir Gideon Blackwood had wronged a woman and chosen never to acknowledge it. That wrong had waited 20 years and returned in the form of a patient, intelligent, and ultimately lethal avenger. The 4 dead men, one of whom had indeed wronged Soane by knowing too much, 3 of whom were simply architectural features of a scheme, were the collateral consequence of a grief that had been given no other outlet. I said something of this to Holmes, who had settled into his own chair, and was regarding the fire with the loose, post-case attention that I had learned to recognise. The tension of the investigation released. The mind still turning, but without urgency. "You are constructing a narrative of tragic inevitability," Holmes said. "It is a natural impulse, and not entirely wrong. But consider the same circumstances, the same wrong, the same years, the same grief, have produced, in other men, in most men, a different outcome. Philip Soane had options that did not involve murder. He might have pursued a legal challenge. He might have spoken publicly. He might have used his access to the estate's affairs to gather evidence of his parentage and compel acknowledgement through legitimate means. He chose not to. At some point, the grievance became preferable to the resolution, because resolving the grievance would have ended the identity that the grievance had given him. I considered this as... You are saying the murders were in some sense self-sustaining? Pete, that he needed to keep killing to maintain the purpose that killing had given him. I am saying that the difference between a man with an injustice and a man who commits murder is not merely the severity of the injustice. It is something interior. A decision made at some point that the self is owed something that the world will not provide, that the provision must therefore be taken rather than received. He picked up his violin, not to play it, but to hold it, which he sometimes did when thinking. The interesting cases are always the ones where the criminal is not simply venal, where there is a genuine wound at the origin. It does not excuse, but it explains. And explanation is more interesting than condemnation. 4 people are dead, I said. 4 people are dead, he agreed, and Philip Soane will hang. Dora Blackwood. And Dora will live alone in a large house, and gradually, I think, find that she does not dislike it. Cornelius Blackwood will get his timber rights. And Miss Quelch will recover and return to running the household with iron precision, and she will probably never speak of what happened, because women like Miss Quelch do not make speeches. He set the violin down. World continues. That is simultaneously the most comforting and the most unsettling thing about it. He reached for his pipe, and I for mine. For a while we sat in companionable silence, while the fog pressed its grey face against the windows of Baker Street, and the city went about its endless, oblivious business below. It was, I thought, watching the smoke rise in the firelight, a case that would stay with me, not for its complexity, which had been considerable, nor for its solution, which had been elegant in the way that Holmes's solutions always were, but for the human architecture beneath the crime, a man shaped by a wrong done to his mother, becoming in turn the agent of wrongs done to others, and ending at last in a Hampshire drawing room with a constable's hand on his shoulder. And something that might, in another face, in another story, been relief. Holmes picked up the remaining correspondence and began to read. The fire crackled. Somewhere below, a cab rattled over the cobbles. Case of Blackwood Manor was closed. Chapter 16, Holmes downplays everything. 3 days passed in Baker Street. They passed in the particular rhythm that followed the conclusion of a demanding case. Holmes slept properly for hours, was unusual, and which I took as a sign of genuine depletion, though he would have rejected the description. He played his violin with the sustained, focused pleasure of a man released from practical constraints. He read chemistry journals, monograph on Baltic amber deposits, 2 issues of the Lancet, and what appeared to be a collection of old court circulars that he had requested from the newspaper archives for reasons that remained obscure. I wrote, I have always found the act of committing a case to paper useful, in ways that go beyond its utility for readers. It compels a sequential order on events that one has experienced as a tangle, and in that ordering, things become clear that were not clear in the living of them. I wrote out the Blackwood case in 3 evenings, interrupting myself only for meals and once for a walk, when the fog relented briefly enough to make the park bearable. On the 4th morning, I laid what I had written on the breakfast table and asked Holmes if he would read it. He read it over 2 cups of coffee, the focused attention he gave to everything he chose to read. When he finished, he set it down and was silent for a moment. You have made me sound more certain than I was, he said finally. You seemed quite certain to me. Seeming and being are not the same. There were 2 points at which I genuinely did not know the direction of the case. When Miss Quelch was found, and I did not yet know if she was a victim or a suspect, and when I held the forged notebook and could not be entirely sure whether it was forged or merely carelessly handled by a guilty man. He sipped his coffee. A detective who is always certain is either very lucky or insufficiently aware of his own uncertainties. Prefer to know when I am guessing. The readers will find the uncertainty reassuring, I said. It makes you seem human. I am human, Watson. I am simply human in ways that are sometimes inconvenient for narrative. He poured more coffee. You have also understated the role of Albert Foss. His information about the inner passage was not merely confirming. It gave me the historical frame that connected the current use of the system to a precedent that explained how anyone in the household might have learned of its existence. Without Foss, the architectural inference would have been correct, but floating without context. I'll add a note about Foss, and you have described Miss Quelch's testimony as careful. It was courageous. She had been living in that house, knowing something was wrong, and fearing, with very good reason, turned out that saying so would result in her death. That is not careful. That is the very particular bravery of someone who has no power, and chooses to speak anyway. I wrote that down. There was a silence. Holmes set his cup down and looked at the window with the expression that meant his thoughts were moving past the case just closed and toward the horizon. The compound, I said. Sowane's Chemical. The analyst in Southampton confirmed it yesterday evening. Chloral derivative compound combined with a tropane alkaloid. The combination produces deep respiratory depression in sufficient concentration, effectively painless, virtually undetectable, without very specific testing. It has been used apparently as an agricultural fumigant, which is how it was commercially available, He was brilliantly imaginative in his way. Holmes paused. I have sent a paper to the Home Office recommending that the compound be added to the restricted list. It will take them approximately 18 months to act on it, and several subcommittees will be involved. The machinery of government, I said, moves at the speed of careful deliberation and interdepartmental correspondence, he agreed, without apparent frustration. Foibles of institutions had long since ceased to surprise him. A letter arrived with the Morning Post, and Mrs. Hudson brought it up on the small silver tray she reserved for first-class correspondence. Holmes looked at the envelope with interest. It bore a crest I did not recognize, and opened it with the paper knife. He read it twice. His expression did not change, but there was a slight adjustment about the eyes that I had learned to read as the first kindling of engagement. Anything interesting? I asked. A matter, he said, concerning a collection of antiquarian manuscripts in Cambridge, a missing scholar, and what appears to be an attempt to alter the provenance records of 3 significant documents in ways that would have considerable financial and historical consequence. He set the letter down. The client is a professor of some distinction who believes the matter can be resolved with discretion. He may be right. He looked at me. Are you engaged this week, Watson? Not particularly, I said, which was true. Also, which was the answer I always gave, because the question in Holmes's mouth was never really a question. Then eat your breakfast, he said. 10 o'clock to Cambridge leaves from King's Cross. I ate my breakfast. The fog, as if on cue, thickened against the windows of Baker Street. The city contracted to a warm circle of lamplight. And Sherlock Holmes reached for his pipe, with the expression of a man who has put one problem entirely behind him, and is already, without visible effort, beginning to inhabit the next. It was, I reflected, watching him, not so much a talent as a way of being. This complete presence in the moment of the case, this complete release of it when it was done, this readiness for whatever came next. I have tried to emulate it across the years of our association with indifferent success. Some men are made for one thing at a time. Holmes was made for the next thing, always. The next thing, whatever it was, being always the most interesting, always the most important, and always when it arrived, exactly as absorbing as he had expected it to be. Fire crackled. The cab rattled below. The 10 o'clock to Cambridge awaited. J. H. Watson, M.D.